is the new evil in our world today. This atrocity was an attack on us all, on people of all faiths and people of none. So we will act, and our determination in acting is total. We will not let up or rest until our objectives are met in full.
Tony Blair, we'll talk about the repercussions of 9/11 in a minute, but just the day itself. I mean, the TUC conference, I think, in Brighton, you were down there. I mean, how did you hear?
So I was at the Trade Union Congress. I was about to give my speech to it. I was in my hotel room in Brighton, and I was preparing my speech, and then I was interrupted by one of my press people, Godric Smith, who came in and said to me, "There's something on the TV and you're going to have to watch it." So I went through to where the TV was in the sitting room. The first plane had hit. We just didn't know what to do. We weren't sure whether to do the speech or not. I decided I would maybe carry on with the speech. But then I went back, started preparing again, and I was called back in again. And this time the second plane had hit, and then it was obvious this was a major terrorist attack. And really from that moment on, the whole of my premiership changed. Global policy changed from that moment.
It was as big as that?
It was as big as that and as obvious as that to me at that point. It's hard now to sort of recapture the moment adequately, I think. But this was, the worst terrorist attack the world had ever seen. It's obviously shocking in itself. Thousands of people killed on the streets of New York by a terrorist group that was obviously, therefore, not merely wanting to cause death by terrorism, but to cause as much death as possible, limitless in its impact. And therefore, everything about the world changed from that moment, because if they were able to kill 300,000, they would. And that's really why, when you look back on it now, and we haven't had another attack of that scale since then, it's easy to forget just how profound was that moment for policymakers and for people.
And the rest of that day, I mean, what happened? You kind of went back to London, presumably desperately trying to find out more about...
Yes, we had to take a whole series of measures, closing down airspace around London. We would, it was one of these situations where you're making multiple calls, trying to sort out the arrangements, because we didn't know whether we would be attacked or not. There were still ongoing attacks in the US.
Did you fear that Britain might come under attack?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was definitely a possibility, wasn't it? So you had to put in place a whole set of preparations, and then I was trying to get hold of President Bush. He actually wasn't able to speak at that point because he was incommunicado, as it were. And then finally we did, and we agreed on certain preliminary actions.
What was the tone of that conversation?
The tone was actually very calm, but both of us were aware that from then on nothing was going to be the same, because you couldn't. If you think back and you think of what an extraordinary event that was, to do that literally, and the Twin Towers were chosen as a very deliberate symbol, not just simply of American power, but of world integration, of globalization. So I was very clear, one, it was an attack on America, but also an attack on all of us, on our way of life, our values, and secondly, we had to stand with America. Now, you can look back now and say, well, as I say, we haven't had a similar terrorist attack since then, but I think curiously, though we have done a lot to diminish the actual threat of individual acts of terrorism of that scale, nonetheless, I think now we have a far clearer idea of the depth of that ideology and the fact that it runs far beyond small groups of extremists.
And we'll talk about all of that in a moment. I just want to dwell on the day for a bit longer, if we might, because just talking about your relationship there with President Bush, because this was the start of something. You'd had a very close relationship with President Clinton. George W. Bush was a new president and not that experienced. You had seemed to be very close to Was it there that you started to forge that close relationship with President Bush?
Yes, I mean, September the 11th is what really drew us together, because of my view was that this was an attack on all of us, not just America, and we had to stand shoulder to shoulder with them in this, that you couldn't say to America, you're going to have to deal with this threat on your own.
Did he share that same view, or did you articulate that view almost and he came to agree it?
Yes, I mean, he was absolutely of the same view. I mean, his view was, this is the defining moment of my presidency. And, you know, look, I didn't look for it, he didn't look for it. It happened.
I just want to talk about one of the other aspects of that particular day, and you've touched upon it, about the fact that you shut UK airspace. And it's in itself an extraordinary thing to do. But I gather there was a passenger jet that wasn't responding.
This was at a later time when we then had to put in place a whole lot of protocols, really, in a sense. I mean, frameworks for action in circumstances where you lost contact with the plane or a plane was not in proper contact with air traffic control. And there was a moment later in my premiership where we weren't in proper contact with the plane. It appeared to be deviating from the path that it was in, and then as I say, there was a set of actions where people were upgrading the seriousness of it until you finally get in touch directly with the Prime Minister. And you know, we were really not very far away from having to take a final decision as to whether to bring the plane down, because we had the provision to do that. We'd already, I think,
had jets been scrambled?
I think they had been, actually, yeah, or certainly prepared en route to take off. Yeah.
How close did that come?
It came quite close, actually. I mean, it was a situation where, I mean, I ended up talking directly to the officer who's in charge of the operation, and trying to work out whether the plane in question was just for some reason a mishap, which obviously was the overwhelming likelihood, but what if it wasn't? So it was an extremely frightening moment.
Would you have given the order?
I don't know. I don't know. I think we'd already passed the first threshold of when I was supposed to take the decision, and I was kind of pushing it back as much as I could for obvious reasons. And I think probably in the end I would have just taken the risk that indeed it was as it turned out to be, just they'd lost touch with air traffic control, because I mean the consequence of shooting it down and then finding that it had been
a faulty radio system or whatever.
But I mean, look, these security questions were there the whole time. I mean, after the 7/7 bombings, the single most difficult thing I had was on several occasions when a threat would come in and people would say, well, are you going to shut down the London Underground? And, you know, my anxiety was that once they knew they could just make the telephone call and you were shutting it down, then you were going to disrupt people in a really, really severe way. And so I then said, well, we're going to keep it open, even though we have had some intelligence that there is a potential attack.
I suppose one of the most striking images, maybe even the word image is wrong, sounds, post 9/11, was the Coldstream Guards outside Buckingham Palace playing the Star Spangled Banner a few days afterwards. I mean, did you kind of have any... How did that decision come about? Was it the Palace who decided?
Yeah, it was absolutely the Palace that decided, but I think it was the Queen that decided it personally. But you know, there was a huge feeling of solidarity and a huge feeling that we should indeed stick with America in this. And the difficulty is that in the years that followed, when all the problems and the issues in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, is that throughout all of that, it was very hard to keep hold of this basic essential notion, which is this terrorist attack had occurred, it had killed thousands of people, and the ideology that gave rise to it was out there still willing to do more damage. But then, you know, you lose that. In the moment these things happen, you have a sort of clarity that over time gets blurred.
And soon afterwards you said that the world understands that whilst of course there are dangers in acting as we are, the dangers of inaction are far, far greater. The threat of further such outrages, the threat to our economies, the threat to the stability of the world. Did our actions make the world a more stable place?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, not in the sense that we haven't gone through some ghastly events since then. But I think if you look, this is the big question about 9/11, the really big policy question, which is, should you just have said, okay, we're going to treat this as an isolated terrorist act, we will, tighten up our security measures, but otherwise we're not going to go to Afghanistan, deal with the Taliban, I mean, never mind Iraq and all that, but even in respect of Afghanistan.
Well, 10 years on, people might say, well, have you dealt with the Taliban? The Taliban are still there. There's an insurgency still going on. That when American and British troops pull out, there's every possibility that the Taliban could come back and take control.
So the question is, what is the consequence of that, of saying there's still a problem now 10 years on? Does that mean actually you should just have said, well, look, we'll just leave this?
Well, I mean, I suppose the argument then would be, well, if you hadn't got distracted by Iraq, then you had more or less done the job after 2001 in Afghanistan, when the Taliban had been purged from the country.
Yeah, but I think this is the problem, really, that in the end I think what we now know is that actually we hadn't, and the problem is that it goes far deeper than pockets of extremists. And that's why I think, supposing you'd taken the decision and said, okay, we're not going to invade Afghanistan, we're going to leave the Taliban there, we'll threaten them, we'll take security measures, but we'll contain it. Supposing you've gone for that policy, well, who knows, you can never know about these things, but my view is that movement would have grown in strength. I think over these last 10 years we've degraded it hugely, we've learned how to fight it, but we haven't destroyed its ideology. And we haven't destroyed, which I think is the far bigger problem now. This is where I would view things differently now than 10 years ago. I think the problem that we have is that the narrative that they have, the story about Islam and its relations with the West and the role of religion in society, that narrative has far greater reach and scope than we thought.